Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Ben Pink-Dandelion. I look after the work of the Centre for Research in Quaker Studies at Woodbrook, connected with the University of Birmingham. I'm joined by Lily Chadwick, also part of the CRQS and Woodbrook team. And it's a great pleasure to invite you to the to welcome you to the 2025 George Richardson Lecture. The lecture is hosted jointly by the Centre for Research in Quaker Studies and the Quaker Studies Research Association, QSRA, and it began at the University of Sunderland in 1996. It's named after George Richardson, who was a South Shields grocer, an evangelical friend, a contemporary of Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce. And it said that his letter to the friend in 1862, 2 years before he died, led to the formation of the Friends Foreign Missionary Association. So a Northeast Quaker to name a lecture that began in the Northeast of England. It's an annual lecture and it's given by someone working at professorial level on a subject of their choosing, obviously in the area of Quaker studies. And it's a great pleasure today to be welcoming Julie Holcomb from Baylor University, Professor of Museum Studies there, and probably best known to us in Quaker Studies for her book entitled Moral Commerce, Quakers and the Transatlantic Boycott of the Slave Labor Economy, Cornell University Press 2016, but also her recent chapter in The Quakers 1830 to 1937, The Creation of Modern Quaker Diversity, where she wrote about Friends' response to anti-slavery, women's rights, and the American Civil War. What we're getting this evening, in a way, is a preview of her latest research and probably her next book on George W. Taylor, A Practical Anti-Slavery Man. So I'm going to pass over to you, Julie, with our thanks and our welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. I am going to, let's see, we were laughing about this earlier about, you'd think after 5 years of Zoom, we would have this mastered. And it seems like still trying to find those buttons. Let me see. I want to share out my screen. Can you see that? Okay, excellent. So thank you to Ben and to Lily both. I appreciate the invitation to talk about George Taylor today, George W. Taylor. I also want to thank Ben, especially for his flexibility. As some of you may know, this was originally scheduled for September, and then my husband and I were injured in a car accident in August and I had to reschedule, and I appreciate very much Ben's flexibility in doing that and making that happen. And thank you to everyone for coming out this afternoon, this evening, depending on your time zone. I think I see a couple of people from that I know from the West Coast, so it's still morning there, I believe, for a little bit for a while longer. So it is fitting to discuss George W. Taylor's reform work as part of the George Richardson Lecture Series. If you're familiar with the British Free Produce Movement or the British Anti-Slavery Movement, you've likely heard of Richardson's son and daughter-in-law, Henry and Anna Richardson. The Richardsons were among the most prominent supporters of the free produce movement in the 1840s and 1850s. The couple produced 3 pamphlets in support of the free produce tour of Black abolitionist Henry Highland Garnett: A Revolution of the Spindles for the Overthrow of American Slavery, Conscience versus Cotton, and my personal favorite, There is Death in the Pot. I'll just say that was the title of my dissertation, but that title was lost when we switched to moral commerce when I ultimately published the book. In 1846, Anna Richardson and her sister-in-law Ellen Richardson raised funds to secure the freedom of Frederick Douglass. George Richardson spoke on behalf of Henry and Anna at London Yearly Meeting in 1849, urging friends to support the British free produce movement. He also presided over a free produce movement organized by British abolitionist Joseph Sturge, where Richardson met the American peace activist Elihu Burritt. So very appropriate that we are having this conversation about someone who was so active in the free produce movement within the context of the Richardson lecture. Although I have found no evidence that Taylor corresponded directly with George Richardson, the two men shared numerous connections. In addition to Henry and Anna, as well as Joseph Sturge and Elihu Burritt, both men counted British merchants Josiah Brown and John Wingrave among their many shared associates. So this afternoon, I'd like to talk about George Taylor's his Gurneyite Orthodox Quaker roots and how that shaped his reform work. As Ben mentioned, this is part of a larger book project. So please, I really welcome your questions and your comments. They will really help me as I move forward with the research. So to begin, I'd like to start with an advertisement that Taylor took out in the pages of the Pennsylvania Freeman in 1848. This was one of a series of advertisements headlined "Practical Anti-Slavery." And in this advertisement, he notified the consistent friends, and I underscore that, consistent friends of the slave, of the arrival of a new shipment of free labor linens at his store. Taylor had purchased the store a year earlier from Joel Fisher, who had acquired the store from Hicksite Quaker Lydia White in 1846. From 1847 through 1867, Taylor operated his free labor store and warehouse on the northwest corner of 5th and Cherry Streets in Philadelphia, buying and selling goods produced by compensated free labor. So when I talk about free produce, I'm talking about, or free labor, I'm not talking about free labor, I'm talking about free as in not enslaved, compensated labor. He was one of the most prominent supporters of the 19th century transatlantic boycott of slave labor goods like cotton and sugar. Writing in 1941, Francis R. Taylor described his great uncle as the backbone of the free produce movement in Philadelphia and largely in the country. Taylor's store was a site of a variety of anti-slavery activities. And I've got a few ads for his store here from the Friends Review and from the Pennsylvania Freeman, just to give you a sense of the kind of work that was going on in his store. In addition to selling free labor goods, Taylor edited and distributed newspapers, including The Non-Slaveholder and Citizen of the World. From his store, Taylor helped manage the business of the Institute for Colored Youth, a school founded in 1837 to educate people of African descent. As agent for the ICY, Taylor coordinated the receipt of applications from young Black men seeking apprenticeships in the city. Taylor sold print goods such as hymn cards and books, including Wilson Armistead's highly regarded A Tribute for the Negro. During the Civil War, Taylor's store served as a collection site for seed, clothing, and other goods that were sent south to aid freedmen and women. His store also served as a meeting site for the Clothing Committee of the Friends Association for the Relief of Colored Freedmen and the Women's Aid Association. Amid all this anti-slavery and civil rights activity, Taylor also edited and published Quaker literature and served as the American agent for the British Friend and the London Friend, the primary publications for British Quakers. Wilson Armistead and Frederick Tuckett were among the many British Quaker abolitionists who visited Taylor's store during their tours of the United States. Now, Taylor's store, as I mentioned, was located at the northwest corner of 5th and Cherry Streets. That was near Clarkson Hall, which was built by the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, on Cherry Street between 6th and 7th Streets, and the office of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society located on 5th Street, just north of Arch Street. The PAS and the PASS, reflected in their membership and engagement the breadth of anti-slavery thought and action. So this map that I've got here is from 1855, and that boxed area that's labeled with the number 6, that's where these three sites are located. And I put this on here because I really wanted to highlight for you just how close together these sites were, and what a vibrant neighborhood this might have been in the 1840s and 1850s. So the PAS, which built Clarkson Hall, organized in 1775, emphasized practical, patient, and orderly measures in the fight against slavery. The gradualists of the PAS, many of them Quakers, aided free blacks in court, drafted legislative petitions, and established schools, including Clarkson Hall, which was built in 1812 by the PAS to serve as a school for the city's black children. Named for the British abolitionist Thomas Clarkson, the hall also served as the headquarters for the PAS until the building was sold in 1864. Now the PASS, we need to take care not to confuse the two because they in many ways are very, very different. PASS, organized in 1837, called for the total transformation of society. Members of the PASS were immediatists who believed slavery was a sin that had to be abolished without delay. They rejected interim measures such as the colonization of free blacks outside the U.S. In 1847, the leadership of the PASS hired black abolitionist William Still, who's probably best known for his work on the Underground Railroad. They hired Still to assist in the PASS office, which included a bookstore and reading room. From this site, Still sold anti-slavery literature and free labor goods and distributed the Pennsylvania Freeman. The PASS office also served as the unofficial headquarters of the Underground Railroad, helping to ferry enslaved individuals north to freedom. Together, these three sites, the Free Labor Store, Clarkson Hall, and the PASS office, helped form the anti-slavery landscape of Philadelphia. People, goods, and news moved freely between Taylor's store, Clarkson Hall, and the PASS office. In addition to placing ads in the Pennsylvania Freeman, Taylor and his clerk and nephew Cyrus Whitson aided Still in his work with fugitive slaves. And Taylor and Still were both members of the PASS and the PAS. In 1862, Taylor joined Still in the fight to desegregate public transportation in Philadelphia. In 1875, Still organized the PAS's centennial celebration, while Taylor was among the guests honored for his anti-slavery work. The abolitionist and Quaker communities of Philadelphia were critical to Taylor's entrepreneurial and philanthropic ventures. And this landscape, this landscape in Philadelphia is in many ways a physical manifestation of the network Taylor created to support his work. It's just the amount of correspondence that he carried on in the process of his reform work is just amazing. Hundreds and hundreds of letters. And in a lot of ways, he reminds me of the 18th century abolitionist Anthony Benezet, who would reach out to anybody he thought that might promote the cause. And Taylor did a lot of what we would today call cold calls, sending letters saying, I need your help with this particular issue. Can you help? And so it's just amazing the network that he built. And in a lot of ways, this anti-slavery landscape in Philadelphia and the amount of movement between these three sites really sort of is a physical manifestation of Taylor's network. Taylor played an important role in the abolition of slavery by bringing together a broad spectrum of activists through his free produce work and his membership in the Religious Society of Friends. By emphasizing the connection between slavery and the consumption of slave labor goods, Taylor made the marketplace a key site in the fight for the abolition of slavery. His activism coincided with the utilitarian turn of the abolitionist movement. In the 1840s, abolitionists retreated from the millennial spirit of the 1830s and early 1840s and instead turned to politics and other formal arenas through which to consolidate the work of previous decades. In the late 1840s and 1850s, abolitionist and free produce supporters like Taylor increasingly emphasized what historian Andrew Deamer calls the liberating possibilities of capitalism. Rather than moral suasion, which sought the transformation of the public soul, Taylor stressed moral commerce, which sought the transformation of the public marketplace by targeting slaveholders' bottom line. Today, I want to explore how Taylor's identity as a Gurneyite Orthodox Quaker, and I promise I'll unpack that phrase here in just a moment, informed his activism, and how his story stands in contrast to the radical abolitionism of Hicksite Quakers like Lucretia Mott. To do this, I will explore two major divisions among American Quakers, the Hicksite Orthodox schism of the 1820s and the Wilburite-Gurneyite split of the 1840s. I will frame Taylor's work through two concepts, practical Quakerism and practical abolitionism. Historian Janet Moore Lindman describes practical Quakerism as the everyday enactment of faith, plain dress, plain speech, and a holistic sensibility that infused work, home, and community life. Abolitionists, meanwhile, spoke of practical abolitionism, meaning daily acts of resistance, aiding fugitives, consuming only free produce, and voting for anti-slavery politicians. The Quaker poet John Greenleaf Whittier wrote, "The South cares very little for abstract resolutions. A discussion which ends only in discussion will prove to the poor slave like an invitation to the starving to feed upon air." Taylor embraced this ethos, describing his own work as practical anti-slavery. For him, reform was not simply belief, but practice, a consistent expression of his Quaker convictions lived out in the marketplace and in service to the cause of the truth. So today, for the rest of my talk, I've divided this into really three broad sections. I want to talk first about his early influences, which included three significant Quakers, John Woolman, Elias Hicks, and Enoch Lewis. Then I'll talk about the Hicksite Orthodox schism, and then finally wrap up with the Gurneyite-Wilburite separation. So George W. Taylor was born, and the W is actually Washington. George Washington Taylor was born in 1803 in Radnor, Pennsylvania. Located 12 miles west of Philadelphia, Radnor was settled in 1683 by Welsh Quakers attracted to William Penn's promise of religious freedom. Among them, Taylor's ancestor, John Richards. Taylor was the eldest of 7 children born to Jacob and Elizabeth Richards Taylor. In 1812, Jacob Taylor purchased 100 acres of land, a general store, and a tavern, and moved the family to New Garden, about 40 miles west of Philadelphia. George and his siblings helped with the work of the farm and the store. They attended nearby Quaker schools and with their mother attended Methodist services, those services led by their uncle Thomas Batten, a renowned minister, whose services were so zealous they sometimes frightened young George. And he talks about this in his fright in his autobiography. Despite their Quaker ties, the children were not considered birthright friends. Their grandfather, David Richards, had been disowned in 1763, leaving the family outside formal membership. Now, I should note that one family history suggests that Elizabeth Richards was disowned by friends when she married Jacob Taylor in 1802. He was not a Quaker, but I've not found any record of this disownment in the Quaker meeting minutes. What we do know is that in 1817, Elizabeth Richards Taylor and her children joined New Garden Monthly Meeting. Formally joining the Quakers was a transformative moment for Taylor, who soon after adopted the plain dress and speech of the Quakers. As he later wrote, there is an advantage in friends being outwardly known as such. His first plain coat, he recalled, was made of homespun, made of wool from father's sheep, picked and dyed by my mother with walnut bark gathered in the woods by myself, woven and fulled at home, and the coat made by a neighboring tailor. Plain language, however, proved more difficult. In fact, he described it as a great trial. But believing it his religious duty, Taylor persisted until he grew comfortable with the practice. Taylor also read the journal of John Woolman, 18th century Quaker reformer and minister from Mount Holly, New Jersey, whose writings on anti-slavery profoundly shaped Taylor's own convictions. Woolman's anti-slavery activism began in 1742 when his employer requested that he write a bill of sale for a woman sold as a slave. Deeply troubled by the task, Woolman told his employer and the woman's purchaser that slaveholding was inconsistent with Christianity. Over the next 30 years, Woolman developed a broad critique of slavery that targeted the slave trade, slavery, and the consumption of slave labor goods. Woolman lived his testimony, rejecting slave labor products, refusing the hospitality of slaveholders, and wearing undyed cloth as a visible sign of his convictions. As the historian Jeffrey Plank notes, Woolman sought to bear testimony not in words only, but to be a sign to the people. In 1776, after years of anti-slavery activism by Woolman and others, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting banned slaveholding by its members and disowned those Quakers who refused to emancipate their slaves. Woolman's reputation only grew after his death. As John Greenleaf Whittier later noted, as the historian Jeffrey Plank noted, by the 1820s, nearly all public commentary on Woolman exalted him. John Greenleaf Whittier celebrated Woolman in a series of essays beginning in 1847, portraying him as the most influential opponent of slavery in the 18th century. Taylor, a close friend of Whittier, would have read those essays and likely discussed Woolman's ministry with him. For Taylor, Woolman's example remained a lifelong influence, shaping his own commitment to plain living and practical anti-slavery. And just kind of as an aside here, in the 1880s, when Taylor was working on his autobiography, he took great care to discuss the connection between his first wife, Elizabeth Sykes, and John Woolman. Sykes's grandfather had traveled with Woolman in ministry in the 1740s. Taylor, like Woolman, confronted racial inequities at an early age. In his autobiography, he described himself as, quote, thoroughly anti-slavery since childhood, recalling an encounter that shaped his sense of Christian duty. Based on its placement in his account, Taylor was likely about 14 at the time, around the time of his commencement. As he recalls, he was on his way to the grist mill when he felt compelled to stop at the home of a black family. Leaving his oxen in the road, he entered and found the father, who he describes as a Methodist exhorter, too ill to support his family. Moved by the family's plight, Taylor gave them all the money he had with him, about $3 or $4. Later, Taylor returned to the family and gave them several more dollars. He remembered that this small gift was, quote, sufficient for their needs until the father recovered and was able to work. Years later, Taylor met the man's son, now himself a Methodist minister, a reminder of the enduring impact of that moment. For Taylor, this act of compassion was an early lesson in living his faith. In addition to Woolman, Taylor was deeply influenced by Quakers Elias Hicks of Jericho, Long Island, and Enoch Lewis of New Garden. Both urged abstention from slave labor goods. There were, however, significant differences between the two ministers. Hicks, who is described by historian Thomas Ham as the most polarizing figure in American Quakerism between 1800 and 1850, insisted that until Friends renounced slave-produced goods, their hands were stained with blood. In 1811, he published the influential pamphlet Observations on the Slavery of Africans and Their Descendants. Hicks described African slaves as prize goods taken in a state of war. Implicating the purchasers and consumers of slave goods, Hicks concluded, quote, that no man who is convinced of the cruelty and injustice of holding a fellow creature in slavery can traffic in or make use of the produce of a slave's labor. Lewis, a beloved teacher, was known for kindling a passionate love of mathematics and science in his students. And as Helen Hull notes in her History of Westtown Boarding School, Lewis's character and the intensity of his religious life had an intangible but powerful effect on his students, including Taylor. Lewis urged compassion for both enslaved and enslaver. Quote, while it is our duty to bear a faithful testimony against African slavery and against the laws that support it, we are not to forget that righteous ends are to be attained by means compatible with the spirit and precepts of the gospel. End quote. While teaching at Westtown, Lewis raised funds to free a fugitive slave. Years later, he defended his actions as a moral expedient, not a recognition of ownership. For Lewis, abstention was pragmatic, render slavery unprofitable, and emancipation would follow. Taylor studied under Lewis in New Garden and later Wilmington, recalling with gratitude the influence of so capable and good a man. Although Hicks and Lewis influenced Taylor's early ideas about Quakerism and anti-slavery, it was the upheavals of the 1820s, culminating in the Hicksite Orthodox Schism in 1827, that ultimately solidified his convictions. Between 1819 and 1827, tensions increased between supporters and opponents of Hicks. The causes of those tensions were complex. The economic success of Orthodox Friends contributed to the growing divide. Likewise, questions of authority and power, particularly as it was wielded by Quaker elders and members of the Meeting for Sufferings, which is essentially the yearly meeting's executive committee, became entwined with theological debates. Hicks claimed Quakers had compromised their unique testimony by, quote, forming ties with groups, this is coming from Tom Ham, forming ties with groups led by evangelical Protestant ministers, Bible societies, missionary societies, moral reform groups, and as a result, an influx of unquakerly ideas about the nature of Christ and the authority of the Bible had infiltrated Quakerism. Hicks's support for free produce exacerbated those debates. Renunciation of slave labor products was a visible sign that an individual upheld traditional Quaker testimony on plainness and simplicity and had rejected the temptations of the emerging market economy, an economy based on slave labor. Yet when the Hicksite schism erupted in 1827, and this is important to note, advocates of free produce could be found on both sides of the divide. And this was an issue that I wrestled with early on in my research of the free produce movement. You know, I had this vision that everybody who supported free produce was a Hicksite, and what I learned very quickly that was not the case. At the heart of the conflict was a clash between quietism and evangelicalism. Hicks is described by historian Thomas Ham as an extreme quietist who emphasized the inward mystical experience of the light, rejecting external authority and ritual. Evangelicals, by contrast, stress discipline through scripture, ministry, and conversion. These theological disputes unfolded against the backdrop of the Second Great Awakening and religious disestablishment, which created what one historian has described as a spiritual free-for-all. Revivalism encouraged the growth of voluntary associations, often staffed by paid agents. Voluntary associations such as Bible and Sunday school associations were seen as the means by which the world would be made a better place. The expansion of religious benevolence led Quakers to make more explicit their definition of appropriate religious activism. There were many Quakers who welcomed the opportunity to join with other evangelicals in various forms of benevolent activity, including free produce and anti-slavery. Often, though not exclusively, these evangelical Quakers were also more likely to have benefited from the spectacular growth in the nation's economy, becoming successful businessmen and merchants. Visiting English friends in this period, such as Elizabeth Robson, George and Anne Jones, and Anna Braithwaite, intensified the crisis, warning against Hicks's teachings. In April 1827, conflict erupted at Philadelphia Yearly Meeting when Hicksites failed to replace the staunchly Orthodox clerk. They walked out, formed a new yearly meeting at Green Street, and by autumn drew 2/3 of Philadelphia's membership. The separation forced other yearly meetings, including New York, to decide which body was legitimate. During this unfolding crisis, Taylor moved to Flushing, Long Island, to teach mathematics at the boys' Quaker boarding school operated by Lindley Murray Moore. Taylor had been recommended for the position by Joshua Kimber, who with his wife Rachel operated a girls' school near Moore School. Kimber was originally from Chester County, so Kimbers and Taylors were good friends. Born in Nova Scotia in 1788, Lindley Moore was an intelligent, outgoing, and respected Quaker leader. As clerk of his monthly meeting, he wielded considerable influence, and his daughter later remembered him as a Quaker, quote, by birth and conviction, able to cite scripture with ease and untinged by sectarianism. Moore welcomed Taylor into the rhythms of his household, daily Bible readings at breakfast, Quaker meetings, introductions to influential friends, and access to his extensive library. The Moore home was lively, filled with visitors such as his in-laws, Adam and Anne Mott, and prominent British ministers like Robson and Braithwaite. Taylor generally enjoyed these encounters, but at times he found the theological disputes troubling. Writing to his mother in June 1827 after a visit from Elizabeth Robson, he described conversations filled with, quote, public censure and ridiculing of fellow friends. Disturbed, he excused himself to put the boys to bed and did not return. These moments reveal both the richness of Moore's household and Taylor's unease with the divisive theological debates on the eve of the Hicksite Orthodox Schism. While the Quaker community in New Garden was strongly Hicksite, Flushing was an Orthodox stronghold. Taylor arrived with Hicksite sympathies, later recalling, quote, that partial feeling toward Elias Hicks that predominated among most of my intimate friends. In Flushing, however, he was, quote, thrown in among those who were dissatisfied with the doctrines Hicks preached. Whether Moore knew of Taylor's leanings is unclear, but the strong anti-Hicksite sentiment in Flushing, combined with Taylor's homesickness, caused him deep anguish. Here, entirely among strangers, I have been almost ready to wish I had not given up my school in New Garden, he confessed to his parents. I have never heard so much spoken against Hicks, he wrote. My hands have been every day filled with pamphlets relating to the disputes, some of which I read, but I value my time rather too much to take pleasure in reading such stuff. I have therefore laid them down. He was distressed by the pamphlets given to him because they made, as he wrote, Elias a monstrous heretic. This clash between his sympathies and his surroundings marked a turning point, forcing Taylor to confront the sectarian divisions that would shape his eventual Orthodox identity. With Taylor in Flushing and his family in New Garden, their correspondence offers a window into the unfolding schism. Writing after the Philadelphia separation, Taylor urged reliance on the, quote, unchangeable light of life, the immovable rock of refuge. His brother Thomas found himself at odds with his local Quaker community, and Thomas had Orthodox leanings. As he told his brother George, quote, I have a choice in joining the Friends as the meeting will be convenient, and all our most intimate friends and acquaintances of that side. But this is not the thing in question. Friends are charged with denying the scriptures and of being followers of E. Hicks. If so, I do not agree with them, for I must hold the one and reject the other. The schism touched ordinary meeting life. In August 1827, Taylor described the case of Elwood Walter, a Pennsylvania Quaker from Green Street meeting, who presented to New York Monthly Meeting his certificate for marriage to Deborah Coggeshall, a New York Quaker. As Taylor told his parents, after some discussion and the remonstrances of the Orthodox, it was accepted, being carried over their heads by numbers. It was not Walter's clearance for marriage that was in question. Rather, it was because the certificate had been issued by the Hicksite Green Street meeting. As Taylor wrote, the Orthodox opposed it very warmly, as it was acknowledging Green Street as a monthly meeting. In a letter to his sister Elizabeth, written 1 week later, Taylor shared that the wedding had indeed taken place and he had dined with the wedding party. When Lindley Moore learned that Taylor had not heard Hicks preach, he arranged for Taylor to meet with the minister. In 1827, after Westbury Quarterly Meeting, Taylor dined at Hicks' home in Jericho, Long Island. Taylor asked Hicks for a private conversation, and Hicks agreed. Taylor asked the minister a series of questions, such as Hicks's views on the divinity of Christ and the nature of the Bible. By the end of the conversation, Taylor concluded he no longer leaned with the admirers of Elias Hicks. Interestingly, this decisive moment appears only in his autobiography, written 60 years later, and not in his surviving letters. 5 of Taylor's 6 siblings also joined with the Orthodox. Only Sister Elizabeth joined the Hicksites. Of the 7 Taylor siblings, Elizabeth was the only one who remained steadfast in her sympathy for Hicks. As George began to drift away from Hicks and toward the Orthodox views espoused by Moore and others in Flushing, Elizabeth warned her brother to be more circumspect in sharing his anti-Hicksite views outside the family, writing, I would be careful, expressing many sentiments that I did not wish exposed to any of thy correspondents in New Garden. Jeremiah Starr was telling me that thee was an Orthodox, stating what thee had mentioned. Thee must beware of who thee places confidence in, she reminded him. Elizabeth and George disagreed about a sermon that the British minister Anne Jones had delivered at Rose Street Meeting in New York. Elizabeth described it as dreadful, wicked, and of great hurt to the cause she says she supports. George, in turn, defended Jones, explaining that he, quote, did not consider it so very pointed as some would have it. In 1828, Elizabeth married Hicksite Quaker Moses Whitson. Despite their theological differences, the Taylor siblings and their families remained close, and this is somewhat unusual. If you're familiar with the Hicksite Orthodox schism, it was not uncommon for families to be to divide over this over the schism itself. So it's very unusual that the family remained very close even after the schism. So why did George join the Orthodox? His correspondence between 1826 and 1828 reveals a difficult, agonized decision. Influenced by mentors like Woolman, Moore, and Lewis, challenged by Hicks, and shaped by non-Quaker figures such as his Methodist uncle, Thomas Batten, Taylor defined for himself what it meant to be a Quaker and a Christian. His Orthodox leanings during the schism set the stage for his later response to Joseph John Gurney's evangelical teachings in the 1830s. Taylor remained at Moore School until 1829, then returned to Newgarden. That winter, Enoch Lewis invited him to teach at Westtown School. And at Westtown, Taylor met Elizabeth Sykes, an Orthodox friend from Burlington, New Jersey. Born in 1790 in Springfield, New Jersey, Sykes was the youngest of three daughters born to Benjamin and Hannah Sykes Leeds. Benjamin's father, John Sykes, traveled with John Woolman to Maryland in 1748. After the deaths of her sister Rebecca in 1799, her father in 1802, and her mother in 1814, Elizabeth and her surviving sister Hannah took up residence with Peter and Abigail Barker. In 1823, Elizabeth Sykes was hired as the boys' parlor keeper at Westtown. As the lone woman on the boys' side of the house, she was expected to exert a favorable influence on the young boys. Sykes nearly resigned in 1827 after an incident involving several boys who refused to comply with the school's rules for reading scripture. British Quaker minister Stephen Gould described the event as an insurrection. As Gould wrote, the teachers used every means, quote, by argument and persuasion to convince the boys of the impropriety of the course they were pursuing. But they persisted, urging their right to freedom of opinion, calling the New Testament the Pope's book, till they began to cut up their Bibles and burn the New Testament. The school's board condemned the actions of the boys. A visit from the school committee encouraged Sykes to remain at the school. The extant correspondence gives no clue to what drew Elizabeth and George together. Elizabeth was 13 years older than he, 40 to his 27. A birthright Quaker, Sykes had close relationships with many important Quaker families, including the Allinsons in Burlington, New Jersey. In 1831, Sykes and Taylor were married at the Friends Meeting House in Burlington. The two shared a close emotional connection throughout their marriage. Their union was framed by the egalitarianism of Quaker marriage and the patriarchal relationship established by American common law that made George Elizabeth's legal, financial, and political protector. For Elizabeth and George, however, marriage was a partnership of man and woman, quote, joined together not by lust or economic coercion, as one historian notes, but as comrades seeking humanity's greater good. Although Elizabeth did not assume as public a role as George did, she was nonetheless a partner with him in his various reform and business enterprises. After their marriage, Sykes and Taylor settled in Burlington, where she introduced him to the inner circle of the Burlington Quaker community. In October 1831, George assumed responsibility for the Friends Preparative Meeting School. Through Elizabeth, George entered Burlington's Orthodox community and formed close friendships with Quakers like the Allinson brothers, William J. and Samuel Jr., who were both active in temperance, anti-slavery, and free produce. These ties later connected him to Joseph John Gurney and John Greenleaf Whittier, who would be two major influences in his reform work. By late 1832, exhausted by his duties in running the school, Taylor began to consider other options. He and his brother Thomas discussed the possibility of opening a temperance grocery. A temperance grocery distinguished itself as a family grocery which might sell liquor, but unlike more nefarious grocers, did not serve it to customers. Black abolitionists William Whipper and David Ruggles operated temperance groceries in Philadelphia and New York, respectively, in this period. After several months of searching without success, the brothers gave up the idea. In 1834, George and Elizabeth moved to Philadelphia after George accepted a position as agent for the Bible Association of Friends. Organized in 1829, the BAF grew rapidly, establishing auxiliaries throughout the U.S. The organization's goals were to place a Bible in every Quaker family and to see that every friend owned at least one copy of the New Testament. In addition to the Bible Association of Friends, Taylor worked with other Orthodox Quaker organizations, such as the Friends Reading Room Association, and published Quaker and non-Quaker newspapers, including the Farmer's Cabinet, which was a popular agricultural monthly at the time, and The Friend, an Orthodox weekly that began in 1827. Taylor also worked with Whittier on the Pennsylvania Freeman. Beyond his official duties, Taylor and his wife gave Bibles personally to young Quakers, calling it, quote, the best of books, and offering it as a token of our regards. They hoped their gift would encourage the recipient to, quote, receive the benefits to be derived from reading this precious book. These acts reflect both their orthodox emphasis on Scripture and their desire to nurture the faith of the next generation. In this period, Taylor began what would become decades of service to the Institute for Colored Youth, which was established in 1837 with a bequest from Quaker silversmith Richard Humphreys. The ICY drew on earlier Quaker traditions of educating free blacks, dating back to the 18th century. Yet the school broke with that earlier tradition in its daily operations. While a white Quaker board of managers, including Taylor, oversaw the institution, black educators directed its classrooms and training. As agent for the ICY, Taylor coordinated applications from young black men seeking apprenticeships in Philadelphia, another example of his practical abolitionism. In 1842, the Northern Star and Freeman's Advocate urged white reformers to prove their sincerity by apprenticing black youth, echoing the ICY board's call for Friends to, quote, provide useful trades and occupations that would enable graduates to hold independent and respectable stations. With rising immigration in the 1840s and 1850s, employers increasingly favored white apprentices, making ICY's mission even more urgent. Alongside trade training, the school emphasized liberal arts, and many graduates went on to teach at ICY and other black schools. Historian Emma Lapsansky describes the ICY as an important anchor in the black community, forming the nucleus of the African American intellectual community that stretched across Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, and Canada. For Taylor, this work embodied his conviction that abolition required daily, practical commitments to racial uplift. When George and Elizabeth moved to Philadelphia in 1834, they entered a city marked by escalating violence. Although interracial organizations worked to advance Black freedom and civil rights, most Philadelphians were openly hostile. Proximity to slaveholding states, industrialization, immigration, and the growth of the free Black population in the city created a volatile mix. Historian Julie Winch notes that, quote, what was unprecedented in the 1830s and 1840s was the scale of destruction. With riots sparked by events as varied as a carousel dispute in 1834, the opening of Pennsylvania Hall in 1838, or a Black Temperance Parade in 1842. Taylor witnessed this turbulence firsthand and on one occasion even experienced the effects of it directly. The August 1834 riot drove African Americans from a carousel on South Street, leaving one dead and many injured. 2 months later, violence erupted in Moyamensing, a neighborhood in South Philadelphia, when Whigs drove Democrats from the polls. Taylor lamented, quote, "It is a shame to any human beings, not to mention civilized, to act as some do here," end quote. In 1838, Taylor felt the effects of this violence directly when his office in Pennsylvania Hall was destroyed by an anti-abolitionist mob. That violence continued into the 1850s. The Fugitive Slave Act provoked clashes such as the Christiana Resistance of 1851. And in 1855, Quaker Passmore Williamson was jailed for aiding fugitive slave Jane Johnson's escape. Taylor defended him, insisting Williamson had done nothing worse than act out the Golden Rule. For Taylor, these episodes underscored the moral urgency of abolition and the need for practical everyday resistance to slavery. By 1837, when Joseph John Gurney began his American tour, Taylor had already established himself in Orthodox Quaker causes and witnessed firsthand the hostility abolitionists faced in Philadelphia. His reform work unfolded amid the continuing tensions of the Hicksite Orthodox Schism as meetings on both sides issued statements on slavery, abolition, and free produce that only deepened divisions among friends. Within Orthodox Quakerism, a new strand was emerging, what later came to be known as Gurneyite Quakerism, or Gurneyite Orthodox. This movement gained momentum through Gurney's influence during his 3-year visit to the U.S. A wealthy banker with close ties to English evangelicals, Gurney is described by one historian as a charismatic personality, an eloquent preacher, and a prolific writer. Gurney's evangelical Quakerism emphasized 3 key features: collaboration with other evangelicals, urging friends to break down barriers and join with non-Quakers in good works such as abolition, education, and prison reform. Reorienting the role of Scripture, asserting the authority of the Bible rather than the inner light. Now, Gurney never repudiated the traditional Quaker teaching of the inner light. Rather, he believed the inner light was inferior to the Bible as a source of revelation. And then third, justification by faith. That is this instantaneous experience that happens. That's characteristic of evangelicals. Yet Gurney did not abandon Quaker distinctives. He recommended, quote, silent worship, private prayer, and daily self-examination, as one historian notes, and argued that other Christians could learn from the religious society of Friends for their views on war, slavery, capital punishment, and swearing. As historian Janet Moore Lindman observes, quote, Gurney aspired to reform Quakerism by extending some traditions, jettisoning others, and solidifying evangelical beliefs. He sought a middle course between Hicksite heresy and Orthodox reluctance to modernize, making Quakerism relevant to contemporary society and capable of speaking to other Christians. Not all friends welcomed Gurney's reforms. Rhode Island Quaker John Wilbur, who is described as a model of the quietest friends, attacked Gurney's teachings as unsound. Wilburites emphasized the writings of early Friends as nearly infallible and often refused to read the Bible without a special leading. They stressed disengagement from the world, participating only in Quaker organizations. Gurneyites, by contrast, were active in reform and often joined with non-Quakers in those reform causes. Wilburites warned that such activism reflected self-will rather than divine guidance. Ohio minister Joseph Edgerton described abolitionism as a, quote, overactive, restless spirit that devoured like the locust, the cankerworm, and the caterpillar. Indiana Quaker Charles Osborne, however, insisted that good works were essential to Christianity. As with the Hicksite Orthodox Schism, the Gurneyite-Wilburite conflict led to separation. in New England and Ohio yearly meetings divided, while the divisions in Philadelphia yearly meeting were deepened. Taylor himself spoke of Gurney with approbation. After attending 2 large meetings in New York in 1838 with his wife Elizabeth, he described Gurney's communications as long and excellent. Each gathering, Taylor noted, drew more than 2,000 people, underscoring the reach of Gurney's evangelical message and its resonance with Taylor's own vision of practical abolitionism. In the mid-1840s, as the Gurney-Wilbur division threatened the unity of Philadelphia yearly meeting, Taylor aligned himself with the Gurneyite minority within a body otherwise dominated by Wilburites. This minority resisted severing ties with the wider Orthodox Quaker community by refusing to formally recognize the Wilburites. When Philadelphia Yearly Meeting received epistles from both the small Wilburite group in New England and the New England Yearly Meeting, the men's business meeting erupted in debate, and Taylor was part of this debate. Some members urged that both epistles be read, while others insisted on choosing one over the other. The dispute was referred to the meeting for sufferings, and ultimately the decision was made. They reached an uneasy compromise, and for the next decade, these 2 bodies within Philadelphia Yearly Meeting sort of coexisted, but in a very tense and uneasy way. That compromise ended in 1857 when the Yearly Meeting cut off correspondence with all other bodies of Friends. Although it continued to receive members from other yearly meetings, it no longer issued or received epistles or maintained official relations. So they just kind of walled themselves off from other yearly meetings. Within this fractured environment, the Philadelphia Gurneyites emerged as the most active and dynamic members of the meeting. They spearheaded reform causes such as the free produce movement, and in 1847 launched the Friends Review as the voice of Gurneyite Quakerism. As historian Thomas Ham notes, this talented and articulate minority was strong enough to prevent an official break with the Gurneyite yearly meetings in this period. This is before they cut off ties completely. For Taylor, this alignment reinforced his identity as both a committed Orthodox friend and a practical abolitionist, binding theological conviction to reform activism. In the 1840s and 1850s, Taylor's Gurneyite Orthodox Quaker identity expressed itself in multiple arenas. He maintained a long relationship with the Friends Review, writing for and advertising in the publication from its founding in 1847 until his death in 1891. He also advanced education through his support of schools such as the ICY, as well as Myrtilla Miners School for Colored Girls in Washington, D.C., and through his service on the board of Haverford College. In addition, Taylor promoted evangelical outreach by selling and distributing print materials, including hymn cards. His commitments were further reinforced by close collaboration with fellow Gurneyite Orthodox friends, including Abraham Pennock, Samuel Rhodes, Enoch Lewis, Marmaduke Cope, Thomas Worcester, and Lindley Murray Hogue. Yet the most significant expression of his religious identity came through his leadership in the free produce movement. For Taylor, this work embodied the union of Orthodox conviction and abolitionist practice, making reform a lived testimony of faith. Gurneyite Quakers dominated the free produce movement. In the 1840s, Orthodox Friends in Philadelphia, New York, Ohio, and New England organized free produce associations. With working alongside Pennock and Rhodes, Taylor helped organize the Philadelphia Association, drafting the Constitution in 1845. Rhodes, who was praised by William Still for his keen sense of justice and humanity, and Pennock, who had a long history with free produce, having established the Free Produce Society of Pennsylvania in 1827, were central figures in this organization. The Philadelphia Association pledged to expand free labor production, announcing at its first annual meeting the manufacture of 10,000 yards of cotton cloth. Taylor's store, which opened in 1847, was closely tied to this effort, alongside Indiana Quaker Levi Coffin's store in Cincinnati. Taylor, Coffin, Rhodes, and others organized trips made by Indiana Quaker Nathan Thomas to travel throughout the South, locating sources of free labor goods, particularly cotton. Taylor and other supporters of free produce viewed the movement through the lens of capitalism, believing that boycotting slave labor goods could render slavery unprofitable. Taylor believed success depended on securing quality goods and loyal customers. Critics, however, doubted the boycott's efficacy. As New York abolitionist Samuel J. May quipped, opposing slavery through free produce was a bit like bailing out the Atlantic with a spoon. The abolitionist movement's utilitarian turn in the 1840s shifted emphasis away from women's earlier leadership in the movement. In the free produce movement, this shift reflected the strong evangelical focus of Gurneyite Quakerism, where women were not as active in the public sphere. While women had operated free produce stores and held leadership roles in the American Free Produce Association during the 1820s and 1830s, by the 1840s and 1850s, nearly all free produce stores were owned by men, and the Philadelphia Association's leadership was exclusively male. In closing, George W. Taylor's life reminds us that abolition was not only fought in pulpits, legislatures, and later on battlefields, but also in stores, schools, and everyday acts of conscience. As a Gurneyite Orthodox friend, Taylor embodied practical Quakerism and practical abolitionism, weaving his faith into the fabric of daily life. Through his free produce store, his work with the Institute for Colored Youth, his publishing ventures, and his networks of reform, Taylor demonstrated that resistance to slavery could be lived out in the marketplace, in education, and in community service. His story also highlights the diversity of Quaker responses to slavery, contrasting with Hicksite radicalism and Wilburite quietism, while showing how Gurneyite convictions energized reform, Taylor's vision was not abstract. It was tangible, rooted in goods sold, apprenticeships secured, and newspapers printed. Remembering Taylor challenges us to see abolition not only as a movement of ideas, but as a discipline of practice. His life offers a model of how conviction, consistency, and collaboration can transform ordinary spaces into sites of extraordinary resistance. In recognizing him, we recognize the countless others who believe that faith must be lived and that justice must be practiced every day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. That was really fantastic.